Well, we continue our series in Untangled, and we're looking at basically a chapter of Hebrews a week. Thanks to those who have fed back to me that they've been reading Hebrews for the first time in a long time, usually with the coda of saying, what on earth's all that about? Because it is a difficult book, but it's a book nonetheless that is part of the whole counsel of God. It would be a sad thing if we only ever read books that were easy to understand. But I find Hebrews not just a little challenging, but at times it can be very hard to untangle it because it's written mainly to a Jewish mindset, a mindset that we don't have, but a mindset that feeds into much of their background and religious activities and stuff like that. So you need to stay with it in lots of ways. And today we're going to look at chapter 5. We don't look at everything in every chapter because literally we could be here for years doing that. But we do look to get the flavour that Jesus is greater and better. And we've seen that right throughout. You don't need me to tell you that in life, appearances are manicured to such a point that appearances seem to trump substance in a lot of people in a lot of different ways. The rise of social media has fed this appetite to appear to be something on the outside that we actually are not on the inside. And so great energy is curated in developing a kind of an image or an appearance that seems to be together, but inside is a different picture. Throughout the scriptures, over and over again, we are told that God doesn't look on our outward appearance, but he sees what is on the inside. He looks upon the heart, the center of who we are, our soul, our sense of being, our integrity, our character. The great Charles Spurgeon once said that character is who we are in the dark. In other words, character is who we are when not everyone is watching. And that is the test of our character. So today we're going to look at the contrast between the outward appearance and the inward appearance. And we're going to do that by looking at two different ways, or two different people. One being the high priest of the tabernacle of the Jewish faith, and the other one being the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're going to kind of contrast those. Firstly, we're going to look at the high priest, and then we're going to sing and pray together and fellowship around that. And then we're going to look at Jesus and see what the contrasts are. But we do that with the premise of asking this question. If Jesus was really one of us, what would it look like if God was one of us? Now, there was a song about 20 years ago that asked that very question. And it was interesting because it sort of threw up this discussion about, well, if God actually came to earth, what would he be like? And all us Christians went, well, we kind of know. We've got four really detailed, accurate, historically reliable accounts of what it looks like when God becomes one of us in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, you might remember that the writer of the Hebrews is speaking to a group of people who are considering in this drift away from their adherence to Jesus as he is, as the Son of God, fully human and fully divine. Some had said that, well, Jesus is a great rabbi, but he is at best equal with the angels, the heavenly messengers of God. And the writer is addressing that and saying, no, Jesus is far more than a messenger. That Jesus himself is, in fact, the message. And these great claims of Jesus came out, and you look at the first four chapters about how the writer contrasts Jesus against something else. Jesus is greater than Moses, Jesus is greater than this or that. So the first sort of character we're going to look at in this comparison today is this Jewish high priest. Now, the Jewish high priest played a very pivotal role in the worshipping and sacrificial life or sacramental life, or religious life of the people of Israel. He did this in all kinds of different ways. And his outward appearance was a very impressive thing to look at. A very impressive thing to look at. Now, you might be admiring my floral shirt today. You might say, what an amazing shirt from Connor that this man is wearing today. A little sponsorship thing there I put in there. Well, they were 3 for $50. What are you going to do? The outer appearance of this great high priest was amazing. I'll give you a little flavour for it. His outer appearance was off the charts when you would see him. Now, you can't read all the little bits of writing. You can go up to the screen later or change your prescription in your glasses to see that. But he was an amazingly striking image when he was in the temple. I'll give you a little flavour. It says that over his linen tunic, the high priest wore a blue robe. All of this was symbolic about different aspects of Jewish history. And attached to it were pomegranates. They were artistically woven from blue and purple and scarlet yarn and placed intermittently between small golden bells. And I'll get to the bells later. That rang musically with his every movement. You could probably hear the creaking of my bones as I move, but he had bells woven into his tunic. A richly woven multicoloured sash held his robe in place. Next, he wore an apron-like ephod that was woven of gold threads, finely twisted linen and blue and purple and scarlet yarns. His shoulder pieces of the ephod that bore a large stone set in gold filigree, whatever that is. The names of the 12 tribes were engraved on these stones, and on one stone and 6 on the other, 6 on one and 6 on the other, in order of birth. So there's tremendous symbolism about all. It must have taken him about 4 hours to get ready, with all this stuff like that. Anyway, there's a whole lot of other stuff. But R. Kent Hughes is a historian and all this sort of stuff. He said the high priest was crowned with a turban. You can see that with fine linen, bearing a plate of pure gold with the Hebrew inscription, "Holy to the Lord." What a sight this high priest would have seen. We saw a little glimpse of that, didn't we, during the king's coronation. It's the king's long weekend, birthday, all that sort of stuff. But we saw a bit of that, didn't we? That pomp and circumstance, all the pageantry and the outward appearance was well, I don't know, it was impressive or just kind of weird. But to our eyes, it looks like from an era gone by. But when the people of Israel went to the temple, they would see this high priest or a bunch of other priests who would be dressed on the outward to look as if they knew something they didn't. What a sight he must have been. Now, contrast this with Jesus, who's described in Isaiah 53 this way. Who has believed and what have we heard, and who has the arm of the Lord has been revealed to? And this is talking about Jesus. He grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. And he didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, and no appearance that we should desire him. Jesus from the outside just looked like a 30-year-old and a 20-year-old and a 25-year-old and a 30-year-old Jewish man. In fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, to identify him, he wasn't the one shining in a pure white robe with Robert Powell's eyes, as we see in the movies. Right? Remember those images of Jesus in the movies? Jesus always looks like, oh, that's Jesus, the good-looking one in the corner, right? Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ. Judas had to go over and kiss him to identify him to the authorities who wanted to arrest him, because there was nothing about his appearance that would attract us to him. Now that is a difficulty for some of us who have grown up thinking that Jesus is kind of like our boyfriend, because some of the songs that we sing in church can give us that appearance that Jesus is this specimen of appearance. Well, the Bible actually tells us the opposite. It says there was nothing about him that would attract us to his outer appearance. But the writer of Hebrews reminds us and the readers that in spite of his outer appearance, Jesus is better. That word better is used a lot. It's used 13 times in the book of Hebrews. It's better to know whatever you put against Jesus, Jesus is better than that. I've checked all those words, and if there's any offensive ones in them, I'm sorry, I didn't have a look at them. Okay, cats was the one that somebody saw. So better than angels, better than Moses, better than even this wonderful high priest. Colin Buchanan, the kids writer of kids' songs, he had a song years ago that said, God is better than football, God is better than beer. Imagine that in Australian context. Jesus is better. And so we're going to look at that today, about how Jesus is better than a system that was in place until he came. In Hebrews chapter 5 it says this, that every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and those who are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. So this is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the sins of the people. And no one takes this honour on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So what's all that about? So I want to just take a couple of moments of reviewing the earthly qualifications of a high priest and to then contrast that to see whether or not Jesus qualifies, and in fact we'll see that he is better. The first requirement of an earthly high priest was this solidarity. Every high priest is selected from the people is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer sacrifices for sins. So fundamentally, a high priest, or any priest, had to be one of the people. He had to know what it was like to be fallible and weak and sinful, so he could have solidarity with other people. He was selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God. In order to intercede for people, he had to be a person, a man. The second requirement was sympathy. These will all start with S. The high priest would and could have compassion for other people, or should have, because he needed others to have compassion and sympathy for him. And being one of the people made it easier to understand their struggles. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to witness. That's a weakness. That's a great strength to have. We're told that Jesus dealt with people gently and humbly, and we're called to deal with each other gently and humbly. The reason that we can deal gently and humbly with other people, if we ourselves are humble, is that we know what it is like to fail. We know what it is like to sin. We know what it is to feel lost. We know what it is to feel lonely. We know what it is to feel estranged. It is a very powerful thing for us to say to one another, even in our loss, "I know exactly how you feel." A requirement of a high priest was that they would have sympathy, that they would deal gently with the people. Now we know from Jesus' encounters with the religious elite of the day that that was not the case. They didn't deal gently with the people at all. In fact, they lauded their position over them so that they felt like the scum of the earth, while they appeared on the outside to be these wonderful, put-together people. That's a temptation for all of us, isn't it? As one of the people, he should have been able to sympathise and represent the people because he too was a sinner. You know, on the Day of Atonement, which is a very special day in the Jewish calendar, all the spectacularly priest robes would be there, priests in these spectacular robes. And the high priest had to first kill a sacrifice, a bull, for his own sins and his own family. And then he would have to recite what is called the Mishnah, which says, "O God, I have committed inequity and transgressed and sinned before thee. And I and my house and the children of Aaron, thy holy people." He would then say, "O God, forgive, I pray, the iniquities and transgressions and sins which I have committed and transgressed and sinned before thee, and I and my house." That was the requirement, that a high priest, an earthly priest, would know two of their own vulnerabilities before God, that they were not perfect. But again, by the time of Jesus, this was not the case. This was not the case. It was seen as a point of weakness for a person of a high priest or even a priest's position to admit they ever did anything wrong. And when Jesus would point that out, they did what you do and what I do when you are caught in a lie or a truth about you that you don't want to hear. You repel that and go on the attack. The next requirement was selection. Selection. So in order to know what it's like to be a person who fails, we've got to get rid of this non-biblical idea that we love the sinner but hate the sin. That's not in the Bible, by the way. Okay? Love the sinner and hate your own sin. Just think about that for a moment, what the difference that would make to how we accept other people. I don't mean tolerate things that are not of God. I'm not talking about that. But I'm saying that loving people, truly loving them with an open heart and a gentle posture, means that we allow people to go on the journey that they need to go on as well. It's very seldom people will change by simply just yelling change. With Christianity, it has to be an inside-out job. And God has to do the work that we cannot do. God has to do work in me that you can't do in me. And God has to do work in you that I can't do in you. The posture of our heart is crucial to how that goes. The high priest was not an elected position. No one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. The history of Israel shows us that attempts to become a priest or a leader without God's selection always is met in disaster, either in the short term or the long term. The fourth requirement is this requirement of sacrifices for the people. Back in verse 1 it says the high priest had to offer gifts and sacrifices to God, but only he could do this. No other priest could go behind those thick curtains where God was, the presence of God was said to be contained. That's why the bells were woven into his clothing, because people could hear the high priest moving around. Remember, I told you right at the beginning of this series that there were no chairs in the tabernacle to sit down, because it was felt that the work of the priest interceding between God and man was never finished, so there was no time to sit down. And chapter 1 goes to great pains to tell us that when Jesus had died upon the cross, his work was finished. He ascended to God the Father and he sat down at the throne of God, interceding day and night for you and for me. So solidarity, sympathy, selection and sacrifices, they were all the pretty impressive credentials of a high priest. How does Jesus compare? How is he better than this outwardly, magnificently presented religious character? How is Jesus better than what appears to the world to be how religion should look? Well, we're going to think about that a little bit later on.
There exists a love far greater than we will ever understand. A love prophesied for ages. Sent to disrupt the reign of darkness. One to challenge the skeptics. A love that quenches our thirst. Seeks after the sick. And mends the broken. A love that came to our rescue. Despite our betrayal and our denial, we bore the weight of our sin. Facing death by being nailed to a cross. And while darkness appeared victorious, this love emerged from the grave.
So when we approach the scriptures, we approach them as a story, like a collection of books, as it said, in all kinds of different ways. There's For those who are lovers of narrative and great adventures, there's that. There's poetry, there's symbolism, there's allegory. There's all kinds of different things that help us to understand that all of it is pointing to something that is truer and greater and better. And that's where we've been over these last this month or so, is that Jesus is better. That Jesus is better not just than football and beer, but Jesus is better than all those characters who came before him. So we're going to just spend a few moments in seeing how it is that Jesus goes in the kind of selection criteria of this outwardly very impressive high priest, how our high priest is someone who is different in terms of his outward appearance, but a whole lot better than anything before. So on the matter of selection, it says in verse 5 that Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. God had said to him, "You are my son, today I've become your father, and today I have celebrated you." Jesus was not a high priest because of his genealogy. He was not a Levite. They were the ones that went into the priesthood. He was of the tribe of Judah. In verse 6, it tells us that you are a priest forever in the order of this character called Melchizedek. And if you want an interesting Bible study, look up the word Melchizedek and have a bit of a look at what that means. We haven't got time to get into it all, but he is mentioned only twice in the Old Testament, Genesis 14 and Psalm 110. But then he is mentioned, this character Melchizedek, 8 times in the book of Hebrews. Melchizedek, just to give you a real brief explanation, was a kind of a king priest who lived in the time of Abraham, and his ancestry is unknown. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, another name for Jerusalem. He was also a priest of the true God. He lived many centuries even before the Aaronic, the priesthood of Aaron, was established. And unlike their priesthood, his priesthood was unending. And so that's why when the Bible says that you are my son, today I have celebrated you, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, you are different to the lineage of these great high priests. Aaron's priesthood began in the time of Moses and ended around 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So a priest in the order of Melchizedek was one that had no boundary, no time and place, no place that they could see to start and no place to finish. And so Jesus' selection is superior to the great high priest of that particular era. What about solidarity and sympathy? Well, elsewhere in chapter 4, a few weeks back, we saw that not only did Jesus suffer, but he is suffered just like we do. In chapter 4, a few weeks back, the scriptures tells us that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are. Since we know that God became flesh, he qualified for that solidarity. He truly became one of us. He didn't walk around the dusty streets of Palestine or Jerusalem with a kind of a tunic on the outside and a kind of a super Jesus costume underneath. He truly became one of us. He was one of us. He was truly flesh, yet was without sin. In terms of sympathy, he went through stuff that we go through, the temptations we go through. He didn't do this to learn how to be a human. The Bible tells us that he did it because he is the Son of God and the Son of Man. The J.B. Phillips translation says, "Son though he was, he had to prove the meaning of obedience through all that he suffered. Then when he had proved to be the perfect Son, he became the source of our eternal salvation to all who should obey him." Jesus is better. He's not only better in terms of his solidarity and his sympathy and that selection, but he's also better in terms of his sacrifice. During the days of Jesus on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears. Once made or proved to be perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. He became that. And that's why we go on about a cross so much. Last Easter, which wasn't that long ago, but might as well have been 3 years ago, all that's happened between now and Easter just passed, somebody asked me a genuine question that many people think about Easter. And here's the question. They say, I get Easter and you celebrate Jesus dying, but why did Jesus have to die? Why did he have to die? Why couldn't God just love us and send a good example, and Jesus could have said all that stuff that's in the Gospels, but what's the whole obsession you Christians have with him dying? Why did he die? Now, just put that back on you for a moment. What would you say? How would you respond to that 16-year-old? What would you say to them? Would you say, ask the bloke in the floral shirt? What would you say? If somebody said, why did Jesus have to die? I mean, this is Christianity 101, isn't it, really? Why the introduction of Jesus' death on a cross make any difference to what Jesus said and did in those 3 years that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John? If you were to answer that question, what would you say? I'm not going to tell you what I said because that's next week's sermon. So come next week and you'll find out what I said. It may not be a spectacular answer. But why did Jesus have to die? Well, we're told that he became that for which others pointed to. He became the sacrifice that was sufficient to be offered once and for all. Unlike the flawed and fallible high priest, Jesus did not have to offer sacrifice for his own sin. His sacrifice on the cross was not just a temporary place filler until the people racked up a whole lot more sin and he would be sacrificed again. It was a once and for all sacrifice. That's why when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple separating the Holy of Holies was torn in two from the top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. And we'll talk more about that next week. No more would God be separated from his people. No more do we fear coming into his awesome and wonderful presence. Jesus is better. He is greater. He is truer. He's greater than the prophets and the angels and Moses and the great high priest and Abraham, as we'll find out, and the Levitical priesthood and the covenant and the tabernacle and even the sacrifices that were on offer. Jesus is better. So what has that got to do with our lives on this King's birthday long weekend? Well, there are a bunch of options in life that we can live and think that they in themselves will bring us a better life. That they themselves will fill up our soul or our time or our interest or our sense of belonging and purpose. And they're not all bad things. In fact, most of them, except cats, are good things, you see. But Jesus is better than the best thing you have in your life. I got up really early this morning to watch the European Champions final. That's why I'm a little sluggish this morning. And my team, only because they won, I won't tell you who because you might be watching it, my team won the Champions League. And for 5 or 6 minutes, that was just the greatest thing ever at 6:15 this morning, freezing to death. But Jesus is better. And whatever is going on in your life, good stuff, family, relationships, jobs, new car, new shirt, whatever is going on, I'm not going to wear this ever again. Jesus is better. He's better. He's better. Why would we put up for something that's not better? What a friend we have in Jesus Christ, who is better by far. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall. High priests come, high priests go. Pastors start, pastors finish. But Jesus is better. What a friend we have in Jesus.